So hi, I mentioned that I was going to look at or to model the economics of the haulage industry and separate off the driver's element of it. So where the pay and income for drivers fit into the whole equation. So obviously you've got somebody invests into a business, somebody that runs it, and then you've got the various overheads of management, administrators, planners, route planners, whatever they are, whatever they're called. And then you've got the cost of the lorry, or articulated lorries is what I've modelled. And then the charge out rate, so that's your income, and so on and so forth. So I've modelled that into a spreadsheet. So I'll just run through that now. I've simplified it as much as I can do, but it kind of gives you an idea of why the driving rates are where they are, and approximately what that does to the income and the profits of the business itself. So take a look at this if you're interested, and then let me know what you think. Okay, so I've done this spreadsheet, as I mentioned before. And the whole point of it is to look at the costs involved from a business perspective. All right, so you can see that I've separated out the driver costs, and I've basically used all the standard average charge outs, which appears to be around about £3 a mile for a 40 plus ton Arctic. So this is what you charge your customer. So obviously if you're going to do a journey of 100 miles, then your revenue, your income, or your invoice amount from that journey is going to be £300. Now I don't know whether that includes VAT or not, but in any case it gives you a rough idea. So I've also looked up the standing costs, which are fixed. So this is here. This is £48,000. So that's the well. Let me explain this first. That's the number of miles you do a year, and of course, if you're going to calculate your revenue, your income, based on 80,000 at £3 a mile, then your total income is going to be 3 multiplied by 8, which is £240,000 a year. It's not quite that, because I've also looked up the fact that you don't always get a backload. So you drive, and I'm using this terminology that I've read on the internet, but basically the backload is, from what I understand, is if you pick up a trailer and take it 300 miles somewhere else, you may not get a backload to bring back. So those 300 miles coming back, you've still got your fuel costs, driver costs, and so on and so forth, but you're not getting any revenue for it. So in other words, it sounds like that when you invoice the customer will not pay for the return journey. And I read that what you do there is you multiply the backload journey by 60%. So I'm assuming what that means is that 60% of the time you will be able to pick up a backload going back to your original starting point. So that leads to an income of rather than the 3 multiplied by 80,000, which would be £240,000 revenue. This is based on one articulated lorry. Your income is expected to be approximately £192,000. Now I'm not sure whether this £3 includes VAT, but let's leave VAT out of it for the time being. It's an important factor, but it doesn't do anything for this discussion really, because what we're doing here is we're looking at the costs of the driver, and the revenue that you can make from a particular lorry stroke trailer, and therefore it gives you a rough idea of what your company is up against. a lot of people complain, a lot of drivers are complaining that wages have stagnated, and we've already touched on that in terms of supply and demand. But let's have a look at some figures just to see where that all fits in. So here I've assumed 80,000 miles per year. Fixed costs I've looked up, and there are charts on the internet that you can do that. And then running costs, 0.7 pence per mile. So when you add those together, you've got 80,000 times 0.7, and then your standing costs are 48,000. So running costs 56,000. I mean, that's everything: tyres, maintenance, checks, vehicle, fuel, you name it. So you've got so to do that 80,000 miles, you've got to spend £56,000. The standing costs are the lease of the vehicle. Now, whether you buy a vehicle or you lease it, I mean, if you've got plenty of cash and you buy it, clearly that's going to be less than the cost is going to be less than leasing, because if you've got cash in the business to do that, then you're only foregoing the interest on that cash. So if a vehicle costs £100,000 a year and you can get 5% interest in the building society, which you can't at the moment, then you're foregoing £5,000 a year. So your costs are much smaller if you've got the cash to buy these things. But it's generally not the way we work things out. We put a cost, and there's a cost of depreciation as well, because it's depreciated over 7 years. So they're expecting the transport, whatever it is, the lorry, to last for 7 years, and then you write off the cost over that period of time. And what I mean, basically in a nutshell, what I mean there is, if I have to go out and buy a lorry, and I've got £100,000 in cash to do that, then the cost of the lorry is basically the amount of interest you lose in the bank, as opposed to what you gain from running the lorry. So there is a cost associated. But when we look at this, we're going to assume that the lorry is leased, and this gives you the cost of actually having the lorry. I mean, if somebody gave you a lorry for free, then you're going to make a lot more money. But we've got to put in a cost for that. So these are your overheads. So your running costs at 56,000, and your standing costs, which are things like the lease, the depreciation, is 48,000. So your direct overhead for running one lorry, one articulated lorry, I think it's 44 ton, is £104,000. So if you deduct your income if you deduct your overheads, your direct overheads of £104,000 from your income we've estimated 192,000, you are left with this value here. So you get a net 88. So your employer gets a net 88,000 before he pays for the driver. So I've separated the driver costs out of the equation. And the reason I'm doing that is because I'm going to vary the costs. So here you can see we start at £15 an hour, and we're going to assume a 15-hour day. So everybody seems to say that it's very long hours and blah blah, and it's not always that long, but we can adjust this and see what difference it makes. But let's assume that you're doing a 15-hour day. So let's start off with, if we put £10 an hour, which some people say that they're earning. If you were an employee, and these are rough figures because obviously employer NI does change with respect to income, but we're going to assume that your gross, if you're working on £10 an hour, typically 220 days a year, which obviously excludes weekend work, then the gross income you would get is 49,500, and that's 220 times 15 hours times an hourly rate. So add in the employer's national insurance. There's a minimum amount for pension, which I put in at 800, and Actually, that should, yeah, that's probably about right. I think the absolute minimum. And the cost to your cost to the employer then is 57,131, because remember you've got to pay your own national insurance, but the employer also has to pay. It's around about 14%. Now, so that's the cost to the driver when you're on cost of the driver when you're on £10 an hour. So 57 grand a year. Now, of course, there's a lot of assumptions here. This is for the hardest working driver you're going to get. He's working 15 hours per day for 220 days per year at a rate of £10 an hour. So his gross pay at 49,500 may seem high, but we're going to adjust this. But the numbers are correct. If I just put that, if I double click this, it tells you where the numbers are coming from. So it's a simple case of I work 220 days per year at £10 per hour, 15 hours per day, and that's what I get. Now we can adjust that in a bit to make it perhaps more realistic. In fact, I should have recalculated this. It was still based on £15 per day. So your overhead at £10 per hour is let me just recalculate. Your overheads at £10 per hour. So it's not set to auto recalc, so I have to do that manually. Your overheads at £10 per hour. Cost of the driver is 33 grand. Cost to the company of the driver, included employers' national insurance and pension, is now 38,354 at £10 an hour. Now, in any organisation, you're going to have a boss, you're going to have a planner. These are things that I've read about. You're going to have some kind of headquarters with heating costs, computers, and all sorts, communications, telephones, whatever. So I've put in an admin overhead of 10%. So I've just written that as 0.1, which is the same as 10%. 10 divided by 100 is 0.1. 10 per 100, basically that means. And then you get an overall cost absorbed into the firm of £19,200. Now, of course, if you're an owner-operator and you've got one truck, then this admin overhead will disappear altogether, because you'll be doing, you may have to include accountancy costs, but it will be much smaller than 10%. An accountant might charge you £500 a year. So that's what this will basically be removed from the equation if you're an owner-operator. I'm not going to focus on that here, because in reality, most people work for somebody. So whether they're through an agent or whatever, it's probably useful to understand the costs involved. Right, so on £10 an hour, the owner of the lorry, and let's assume that they've got an overhead cost of 10%. I think that's pretty conservative, by the way, because it may well be quite inefficient, but we can adjust all of these figures and see what the employer's profit before tax is. So if an employer was incredibly efficient and they only absorb 10% of the overhead cost, because remember, in a large company you can have big accountants, expensive management, chief executives that like to pay themselves millions, so it's likely that this admin overhead could be much higher. So we can fiddle around with the numbers to see what it works out at, but let's stick to the driver from a driver's perspective, because everybody thinks £10 an hour is not worth it. So let's up that to £15 an hour, which I think I've seen where people are quite happy with that. Let me just recalculate it all. Right, so on £15 an hour, we've got, again, the hard-working guy, 15 hours a day, 220 days a year. He's gonna gross 49.5 grand. Of course, that's if he does these hours, and then employers, NI, pension, and his cost to the company then rises to 57 grand, or just over. The admin overhead we leave. This is 10% of the revenue, so your income. So that basically stays static when you're looking at it from a single driver perspective. And then the employer gets a profit of 12.5 grand by running at these kinds of numbers. So if we put that up to £20 an hour, which I understand is about the limit of what most people get, then we've got the business making a loss of around about £6,300. So if you are stuck and you cannot get more than £3 per mile, and your backloads are 60%, only 60% I should say, I don't know what the reality is, but obviously better planning there can lead to more income. And so if your backloads here I've put are at 60%, but let's say that increases to 90% because you're a lot more efficient, then I can change that here, and then just let me recalculate it, and then suddenly your income is 228,000 a year. So all these parameters are important. So if you run an efficient, super efficient operation where you're charging for practically all outward bound loads and 90% backloads, then your income's going to go up, and it will maximise at 240. So we've got 80,000 miles times 3 is 240,000. So in other words, if I can charge £3 a mile out and £3 a mile back, then my maximum is going to be 240,000 revenue. I'm going to change this back to 6 because it seems that that's the average from what I've seen on the scale. So obviously a more efficient firm is going to make a lot more money than a less efficient firm. And again, this overhead can make a huge difference as well. So if you're making a loss per truck of minus 6,300 because you're paying £20 an hour, then you're not going to be in business for much longer. So there is a limit on this. But let's say if I say that there is basically minimal overhead. So what I'll do is I'll put a few zeros rather than take it out altogether, because I don't want to do a divide by 0. I'll just make it tiny, so it's almost insignificant. So if I recalculate that, so it's practically 0. There's no overheads. Maybe that's an owner operator. It might just be £500. Then on top of this salary, you're going to have a profit of nearly £13,000. But let's be more realistic, that's never going to happen. So let's put in 10%. I would imagine for the larger, more well-known firms, we're going to be probably talking higher than 10%, but they'll have like 1,000 trucks. So even if the bottom line, if they charge, for example, let's get this back into profit. We'll put that at something like, let's say 17. Let's look for the break-even point for the business. Okay, so it's going to be slightly higher than that. So basically, if the business doesn't, let's make it 18, there'll be a break-even point. It's probably something like £17.50. Oh, a little bit higher. 18. Let's try 18.5. You see what I'm doing here, as I'm just changing the number of pounds per hour. Right. Okay. We're roughly breaking even. So it's probably something like £18.20 is the point at which. Yeah. Okay. So look, practically breaks even. And what this really means is, it's if you're running a business. And by the time you've paid all your outgoings, your fixed costs, or they call it standing costs, your running costs, your driver's costs, and then your admin overhead, there's going to be some admin. I mean, if you've got 10 lorries, 10 trucks, then is it worth that's probably £1 million worth of equipment. Is it worth staying in business for 10 times £263, or if you're paying £18.25 an hour and you're only able to charge a maximum of £3 a mile, then you're gonna put £1 million into a business to make practically nothing. 2.5 grand is what this is saying. And with a cost overhead of 19,200 per truck, you're talking 10 times that, because if you've got 10 trucks, you're going to make your overhead's going to be 200,000, and 10 trucks you're probably going to have one planner, probably the owner, maybe an admin assistant. So your cost might be a little bit less than that, but you can see that on the numbers that are available on the internet, kind of £18.25 is kind of the break-even point. If you don't cut corners, then £18.25 is kind of the break-even point for the owner of the truck. Now, of course, if you've got 1,000 trucks, then these absorb costs are going to go higher. So you have a bigger building, you have more planners, more managers, more hangers-on, administrators, paper shufflers, accountants, and God knows what, IT guys, they're expensive. Then this goes up, but obviously your revenue goes up, because this 80,000, if you multiply that by 1,000, then you've got 80 million times 3. So your revenues are 240 million. But the mechanics of the calculation stays practically the same. The only thing that changes this figure for your overhead. But of course, that can still be around about the same, because the absolute cost of running 1,000 trucks still might be 10%. And of course, your revenue is going to be 1,000. That's going to be 192 million if you've got 1,000 trucks. So it all scales up, and then the break even at roughly £18.25 per hour, which gives you a profit of £263, which it's not worth the investment. So if you went to a businessman and said, well, if you've got £1 million, well, we're going to give you 2,000, you lend us £1 million, we'll give you £2,600 a year in interest, you're going to tell them where to get off. So what's a reasonable rate, given the mechanics of the business? And remember, it's this £3 a mile that limits everything. If you can charge £4 a mile and get away with it, then it changes the whole equation, because that's a 25% increase in your revenue. And I'll do that in a sec, but for the time being, let's keep it at what the industry thinks that the average charge out is. So if I go back to £15 per hour, which I think most people seem to think is about right, that's giving you and again, it's working on this long day, 5 days a week for 220 days per year, and then you're getting a gross income of 50 grand, just short. Cost of the company 57,000. We'll leave the overhead, I don't know what that is, but it can be adjusted, and then it's giving your employer a profit before tax of 12.5 grand. So you can see that the profit margin is very fine for a single truck if you've got these kind of overheads. It's probably quite realistic, actually, but you can see therefore that there is a limit with this kind of work, and that limit seems to be around about £18.50. If you're getting more than £18.50, then one of two things is happening. One of a number of things is happening, but the main, let's assume everybody's not cutting corners, they are abiding completely 100% by the rules, they're doing all the required checks and administration, and so on and so forth, then they must be charging more than £3 a mile. Now, it may be the case in specialist industries, I don't know, low loaders, I'm reading is quite specialised, or perhaps they're doing more than 80,000 miles per year, and that's quite possible. If you've got a large company, you'll have a guy working days and perhaps a guy working nights, or double manning the machines or whatever it is, then obviously these things can alter the model. But if you're wondering why people don't want to pay more than £18 an hour, it's because most likely, on average, they're not going to make any money out of that truck, and nobody wants to run a company that just breaks even. So if we take it down to more typical £12 an hour, then your cost as an employee, cost of the company is going to be 45 grand for very long days. Remember, most people work an 8-hour day, especially in the public sector. So you're working almost twice as long as everybody else. I'm not suggesting that that's a good or a bad thing. I mean, my previous careers, let's call it, in inverted commas, in the Air Force, you paid 24/7. I think there's a 1 minute a day that's yours, and that's to pray. I think that's an old-fashioned thing. And we worked extremely long hours. We used to work, obviously, shifts. If you're on something called QRA, which is the quick reaction alert, then you don't do a lot, obviously. You sit around in a crew room waiting for something to happen, but you're at work. Driving 15 hours, you can only drive 9 to 10 hours per day, but you can be at work for 15 hours, or you can be doing things, or if you're tramping or whatever it is. Now, I'm no expert in these things, but I've only been reading about it over the last few weeks and discussing it with lorry drivers. However, it is a long day, and we can adjust that and see what difference it makes. But you can't go. I suppose we shouldn't take it below 9 hours, because otherwise, then you're underutilising the truck, and that, of course, this can happen. So let's have a look at £12 an hour. Let me just recalculate that. So we've got we're making 23 grand, and let's call it an investment of 100,000. So you're making about 23% before tax at £12. This is kind of like what a chip shop would make, between 15 and 20% tax. So if you're going to run a haulage company, these are the sort of, it's high risk, so these are the sort of percentages that you want to earn. So the employer wants to pay you this, and every penny that you get more than this is less for him, as we've seen. Right, let's reduce this to something a little bit more realistic in terms of what other people do. So let's say 10 hours a day, because you can easily do that working on a trading floor. Then you can see then that you're still doing your 80,000 miles. You're doing 10 hours per day, £12 per hour. Then your gross income then falls to around about 26.5 grand. I'm not taking into account any extra payments for overnight stops for trampers or international drivers who perhaps get extra bonuses or whatever. But your cost to your employer is 31,000, just short. Overhead cost, again, let's leave that at 10%. And then your employer is starting to make 38,000, just 38,000 odd. Just short of 40,000, and if your truck costs £100,000, then you're looking at a profit, an annual profit of 38% on the investment. Now, I think that's quite high for any business. Again, this is very rough. There are lots of things not taken into account here. So, what would I expect to be a decent pay for a lorry driver? And I think it should be more like 15. I'll tell you why in a second. Let's just recalculate that. Right, so at £15 an hour on a 10-hour day, and of course you can do overtime, and it's going to vary, as we've seen, then your gross is going to be about 33 grand a year, which is probably more than a nurse. I don't like to compare anybody to nurses, because nursing is traditionally low paid for the skills that are required to do that job, but that's the way it seems to be. I mean, bankers can earn millions. Some bankers can earn millions, and some would say that they're not worth it. But there's a reason they earn millions, and it's because they make millions. But anyway, let's not go into that. If you're in a service industry, of which health is the ultimate service industry, then you are subject to the costs and benefits associated with that. So back to haulage. If we're doing a 10-hour day, which is already a long day, at £15 an hour, then we can see our employer is making about 31 grand per year out of his truck, including his overheads, administrative overheads. So this is your net profit. And some would say, well, he's not doing anything for that cash, but he would say, well, I'm taking all the risks. If the company, if suddenly sales dry up, you don't get any work, then he loses all that money, probably his trucks as well. So you have to kind of look at it from that point of view. Nobody's got sympathy, of course, for rich owners, but that's the reality. So, how much can they afford to pay if you do a 10-hour day and get all your work done? Because remember, you are limited to the amount of hours you can drive. Well, if you get paid £20 an hour for a 10-hour day, so if it was super efficient, you turned up to work and you drove for the full time, which obviously doesn't happen, then cost of the company is going to be about 51,000, makes about 18,000. I would say that's reasonable. As an investor, to return that kind of money, obviously it's a bit of a risk, but you're going to get 18, let's say, on an investment of 100,000, you can get 18% a year, 18.7% a year. This is what it represents. That's a big return. And the way to look at this is, what's the risk of what would I need to be compensated for that massive return? So if I've got £100,000, I can either buy a truck or I can put it in the building society. So if I put the money in the building society, it's risk-free, or it's not risk-free, but it's relatively risk-free, especially if it's less than 80,000, which is covered then by the government. But building societies and banks never really go bust, as we've seen. They usually get bailed out by everybody else or the government, and the customer doesn't lose anything. So let's assume you can get 1% risk-free. Then what this number actually tells you is that there's a 17.7% risk premium on investing in a haulage firm. And if the haulage firm is run efficiently, and that's the amount returned to the investor. So this is not the manager, and that the management costs and the planner's costs come out of the admin overhead per truck, which we've got at 19,200. So if you've got 10 trucks, it's a couple of $100,000 a year to pay for your planner and your and the management, paperwork, administrator, secretary, whatever. Then you get in a pretty decent return, and this is kind of the sort of return that you should be happy with as an investor. So based on a 10-hour day and a £20 per hour rate, the model shows that this business, run efficiently, or let's say run on average, because the backload at 60% is an average. Some people might get no backloads, in which case it's going to run more inefficiently. And it's probably the case that the lowest rates available out there are because they are run inefficiently. So that rounds that up. I mean, I've summarized it and tried to make it as simple as possible. You can break these figures down into more complicated numbers, which will then tell you exactly how much you get for fuel, how much the cost of fuel is per mile, how much the cost of maintenance you should budget for, and so on and so forth. And I've summarised that. I've got all those figures, but I've summarised them all into a much simpler spreadsheet. So anyway, I hope you found that interesting. And in my view, if you're doing a 10-hour day and you're doing 80,000 miles a year, there's no reason you shouldn't be on a rate of £20 per hour. Now, this, of course, all of these things are averages, so there's going to be people whose maintenance costs will be a little bit higher. Maybe they're running older vehicles, where maybe some will cut corners, break the law even, and so on, which I've read about, or I've read people saying that they do. And there will be others that are run super efficiently, that can easily afford to pay £20 an hour, and do, to get what, they'll get the pick of the crop, and they'll obviously have a stable, one would assume, then they'll have a stable revenue, driver pool, let's say. Drivers are very important to this industry, of course, because nothing happens without them, but they're not the only important thing. Somebody's got to get the work, and somebody's got to take the risks, and they do need compensating for that. So it's all, you've got to see where drivers fit into the whole equation. They're not taking the same risk. Well, I know their operator is, but other than if you're working with somebody else, you're not taking any risk, other than the risks involved in driving, a huge lorry. So there we are. Anyway, I don't know whether anyone will ever see this, or if it sees the light today. I'll certainly put it onto YouTube, and maybe somebody will come across it and find it useful. Right, so that's it. So as we can see, the pay that, or the amount of revenue that's available to be paid out to a driver, is variable, and it very much depends on how efficient the company is, and what their costs are, and therefore how much the investors within the company, which may be the owner, needs to take out for it to be worth as well. So I hope that gives an idea, but it sort of puts it into a little bit of perspective, and I did this for my own interest, and hopefully other people will find it interesting too. Okay, thank you, thanks for watching.